11 July, 1944. Hill 192, east of St. L. A German captain pressed his field glasses against his eyes and frowned at what he could not see. Below him, the bocage country stretched in a green checkerboard of small fields, each wrapped in earthen banks topped with brush and trees. He had defended this ground for weeks. He knew its rhythm. The Americans would come visibly, slowly, dragging their tanks behind them, and his machine guns would chew them apart in the lanes. But today, the rhythm was wrong. Fire was coming from angles he could not map. Rifle grenades cracked into the corners of his forward hedge. A small mortar dropped around behind the bank, exactly where his crew was sheltering. Then, another. And then, impossibly, men appeared inside the field, not crossing it, not charging it, but already inside it, moving low along the inner edge of his own hedgerow. He turned to his runner. "Wo sind die Panzer?" "There are no tanks, Herr Hauptmann." "No tanks?" His voice was flat. "Then how?" A grenade rolled into the corner machine gun pit. The gunner did not have time to scream. This is not a story about heroism. This is a forensic audit of America's infantry Hedge-Breach system. A system the German command never expected, never fully understood, and ultimately could not counter. By the time they tried to describe it in their own reports, they were using a word they almost never applied to American infantry. They called it scientific. If you love discovering the untold stories of World War II, hit that subscribe button and join the WW2 Elite community. Drop a comment below telling us what's fascinating you today. To understand what unsettled that German captain on Hill 192, you have to go back to early June, when the Americans first walked into the bocage and discovered it was not terrain. It was a machine. The fields were small, some were the size of a tennis court. Each was wrapped by a wall of earth 6 to 10 feet high, with trees rising another 20 feet above. Inside that wall ran roots like iron rebar. On top sat brush so thick a man could lie 3 feet from another and not see him. Sunken lanes between the fields ran like trenches that nobody had to dig. From the German point of view, every field was a small fortress, fully furnished, already roofed. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had walked this country before the invasion and understood it instinctively. He told his staff plainly, "The first 24 hours of the invasion will be decisive. For the Allies, as well as Germany, it will be the longest day." But once the Allies were ashore, Rommel knew the bocage gave him a second chance, a defender's chance. General Eugen Meindl, commanding the 2nd Parachute Corps in the St. L sector, was even blunter to his staff officers. "We do not need to win here. We need them to bleed for every field. 5 Americans for every one of mine." That is the arithmetic. For 3 weeks after D-Day, that arithmetic held. Omar Bradley, commanding 1st Army, stood over a map at his command post and shook his head. He turned to an aide. "This is the damnedest country I've ever seen," he said quietly. "We fight for a hedgerow. We win it. Then there's another hedgerow. And another. And another." The aide nodded. "Sir, the divisions are reporting they're moving at 100 yards a day in some sectors." 100 yards. Bradley pressed his fingers against the bridge of his nose. "At that rate we won't be in St. L by Christmas." But here's what nobody noticed at the time. While the front pages in America were still reporting yards and bodies, something quieter was happening at the company and battalion level. The Americans were learning, not in classrooms, in the hedgerows themselves, and they were beginning to write it down. To see how it started, you have to leave the generals and crawl into a ditch with the rifleman. Ernie Pyle, the war correspondent who lived with infantry the way other men lived with families, crouched against a hedge bank in late June and watched a squad work. He scribbled in his notebook in pencil, half a sentence at a time. A young sergeant turned to his barman. "You see that corner? The far one? I see it. There's a gun in it. Or there will be in about 20 seconds. When I tap your shoulder, you empty a magazine into that corner. All of it. Don't aim pretty. Just put steel through that brush. And then Cohen pops a rifle grenade. Then Merrick and Walsh go down the inside of our hedge to the gap. They don't cross the field. They never cross the field. The barman wet his lips. What if there's a second gun? The sergeant almost smiled. Then we do it again on the other corner. We keep doing it until the field is ours. Then we do it to the next field. Pyle wrote that night, by candle stub, that this was no longer the kind of war the newsreels showed. There were no bayonets fixed against the sky. There were no shouted charges. There was only what he called a slow, cautious business, and the men who learned it best were the ones who lived. But by the second week of July, what Pyle was watching in one squad was being repeated across multiple regiments. And the Germans, who had built their defense on the assumption that Americans would always attack the obvious way, began to notice that some of their hedgerows were collapsing in patterns. Predictable patterns. Patterns that looked, to the German eye, almost rehearsed. The man who would unknowingly become the symbol of this change was Major General Charles Gerhardt of the 29th Infantry Division. Gerhardt was not a beloved commander. His men called him Uncle Charlie, sometimes with affection, more often without. He wore polished boots in mud and ran his command post like a parade ground. But he understood, before most of his peers, that the bocage was not a problem his tanks could solve. In the first week of July he stood before his regimental commanders and pointed at a sheaf of mimeographed papers on the table. "Gentlemen, look at these." The papers were sketches, diagrams, little drawings of a single hedged field, with arrows showing where the suppressing fire would go, where the rifle grenades would land, where the breach would be blown, where the assault team would enter. A colonel picked one up. "Sir, you want every platoon to learn this? Every squad? Every fire team? I want them to do it in their sleep. I want them to do it when their lieutenant is dead, and their sergeant is shot, and the radio is broken. I want it so deep in their muscles that they don't need orders to do it." He turned to the door. "Because right now, the German thinks we're going to come at him the way American infantry has come at every enemy since 1917. We are not. We are going to come at him in a way he cannot rehearse a counter for, because we are going to come at him the same way, every time, but faster than he can adjust." What Gerhardt was describing, and what his staff had quietly diagrammed and circulated as training memoranda, was the seed of something the historian Michael Doubler would later call the most important tactical adaptation of the American army in the European War. It was not a weapon, it was not a vehicle, it was a drill, and that drill had already been written down. On the morning of 11 July, Major General Walter Robertson of the 2nd Infantry Division stood near his forward command post and listened to the artillery preparation pour onto Hill 192. The hill dominated the approaches to St. L. Whoever held it could see for miles. The Germans had held it for weeks. A staff officer approached. "Sir, the 38th is moving." Robertson nodded slowly. "Tell them to take their time. Not a minute longer, not a minute shorter. Tell them every hedgerow gets the full treatment. Every single one." "Yes, sir." Robertson watched the smoke roll along the slope. He spoke half to himself. "We are not going to lose this hill twice." By noon, the 38th Infantry was on the crest. The Germans, who had thought of Hill 192 as the eye of their St-El defense, suddenly found their eye gouged out. In a German command bunker not far away, a regimental officer of the 3rd Parachute Division was reading the day's strength returns out loud to his commander. His voice was tight. "Sir, we are at 35%. Of what?" "Of strength, sir." "The division." 35%. The commander closed his eyes. "And the Kampfgruppe from the 353rd? They went in with 1,000 men. They have 180 left." There was a long silence. The commander finally said, "Send the report up, word for word. Do not soften it." Up the chain the report landed on the desk of Paul Hauser, commanding the 7th Army. Hauser was an old SS general, hard-eyed and not given to panic. He read the numbers twice. Then he sent a runner. "Get me Army Group B operations." When the line cleared, the voice on the other end belonged to a staff officer he knew well. Hauser did not waste words. "The line is bleeding through. St. L cannot be held in place much longer. I am asking for permission to fall back." The operations officer hesitated. Then he said the line that would later be quoted in the official accounts. "You take whatever measures you think are necessary." Hauser set the receiver down. He looked at his chief of staff. "Did you hear that?" "I heard. That is not an order. That is a man who does not want his name on the order." The chief of staff did not answer. He didn't need to. What the German command did not yet realize, what they were still trying to phrase in their reports as a sudden American advantage in some abstract sense, was that they were no longer fighting a series of separate American attacks. They were fighting the same attack, replicated across dozens of fields, by units that had learned the same drill from the same diagrams. And that pattern had already been written down. To understand how the drill actually worked at ground level, follow a single 29th Division squad through a single field on 12 July. The squad leader, a sergeant from Virginia named Hollis, not the famous Hollis, just a sergeant with the same name, crouched at the inside corner of a hedge. The field, in front of him, was perhaps 40 yards deep. The far hedge bristled. He had been here, in fields like this, for 35 days. He turned to his assistant squad leader, Thomas. 2 BARs on the right corner. Full belts. "I want noise." "Yes, Sergeant." "Riflemen, you do not show your faces. You feed the BARs. You feed the grenadiers. Nothing else." "Sergeant, the tank?" Hollis glanced behind him. A Sherman idled in the sunken lane, 50 yards back, its commander leaning out of the turret. The tank could not get into this field. The bank was too high. The lane was too narrow. The tank was useful, but it was not the point of attack. "The tank shoots when I wave. Not before, not after. He's not coming in. We are." Hollis raised his arm. The BARs opened up. The far corner of the German hedge exploded in splinters. Rifle grenades arced over and burst behind the bank. The mortar team, 60 yards back in the sunken lane, dropped around perfectly behind the far hedge. Then a second. Then a third. The German machine gun never fired. "Now," said Hollis. 2 engineers ran low to the bank, slapped a satchel charge against it, and ran back. The bank blew open in a fountain of dirt. Through the gap, before the smoke cleared, 3 men slipped through and went immediately right, hugging the inside of the German hedge, throwing grenades into the corner positions. The field was theirs in under 3 minutes. That night, when an officer asked Hollis how it had gone, he answered with the flatness of a man who has done a thing many times. "It went the way it always goes now. Same as the field before. Same as the field before that." What the Germans still had not understood was that this system was now bigger than any one unit. But the cost was not invisible. The American edge was real, but it was bought in blood every single day. On the 11th and 12th of July, the 29th Infantry Division alone lost nearly 1,000 men in 48 hours. The 30th Division would lose nearly 4,000 before St. El fell. The 35th, nearly 2,500. The 29th, around 3,700. A young captain in the 175th Infantry, Joseph Ewing, would later remember the bocage with a sentence that captured the suffocating geometry of it. "Every hedgerow," he said, "was a possible enemy position. You did not relax. You did not breathe between fields. You took one. You bled. You took the next. You bled again. You did the same drill. You bled the same way. And somewhere in the back of your mind, you tried not to count. There were small mercies. There were also small legends. One of them belonged to Major Sidney Bingham, commanding the 2nd Battalion of the 116th Infantry. On 15 July, Bingham's battalion punched forward farther than anyone expected and found itself isolated, deep in German-held country, almost within sight of St. El. A runner reached his command post. "Sir, we have no flank contact. Either side. We are out here alone." Bingham looked at the runner and almost laughed. "Then we will be alone closer to St. El than anyone else in the army. Dig in. Keep the radio quiet." For days, Bingham's men held a ridge nobody had told them to hold, in a place the maps had not predicted they could reach, eating cold rations and watching German columns pass in the distance. Another small legend belonged to Captain Doyle Conrad. a forward artillery observer. When American infantry finally pushed into the outskirts of St. El, Comrade went with them, dragging a coil of telephone wire through the rubble under direct fire, so that his guns could see what his eyes could see. He became, in the dry language of after-action reports, the first artillery observer into St. El. In the language of the men who fought beside him, he was simply the captain who would not let a shell go to waste. And weaving above all of these small legends was the larger one, the legend of Major Thomas Howie, the Major of St. El, who would die leading his battalion forward, and whose body would be carried into the broken city, draped in a flag, laid on the rubble of the cathedral, in an image that would travel around the world. By 17 July, the German position was no longer eroding. It was disintegrating. That morning, Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the man who had warned his own staff that the first day would decide everything, was driving back from a forward inspection when Allied fighter-bombers caught his staff car on an open road. Cannon fire raked the vehicle. The driver was killed. Rommel was thrown from the car with a fractured skull. He would never command again. The news raced up the chain. By the time it reached Hausa, the 7th Army commander was already grappling with the collapse along his front. The St. El line was no longer something to be defended. It was something to be evacuated. Hausa's chief of staff stood in the door of the command bunker. "Sir." "The order." "I know." "Tonight?" "Tonight. Main forces withdraw south of St. El, outposts hold until they are pushed. I want the line clean by morning." The chief of staff hesitated. "And the city itself?" Hausa did not look up. "The city is rubble. We do not die for rubble. We die for the line behind it." That night, in the darkness of 17 to 18 July, the main German forces slipped south. They left behind a screen of outposts, whose only job was to make the Americans believe St. El was still being defended. The screen did its work. It bled the lead American battalions for another half day, but by mid-afternoon on the 18th, the screen was being driven in. The man chosen to push into St. El itself was Brigadier General Norman Cotter. Cotter was already a legend in the 29th Division. On Omaha Beach, on D-Day, he had walked among pinned men and shouted them to their feet with a line that would echo through the regiment's history. "Rangers, lead the way." Now, 6 weeks later, he stood at a forward command post and looked at the rubble city below him. He turned to his task force commanders. "Gentlemen, we move at 1500. We take the northeast quarter first. We do not stop for sniper fire. We do not stop for stray mortars. We push to the cathedral, and we plant our flag where the world can see it." "Yes, sir." Cotter looked once more at the map. Then he said, almost to himself, the line that captured the whole campaign. "This city has cost us too much to walk into quietly." Task Force C moved out at 1500. By 1800, the lead jeeps were nosing into the northeastern streets of St. El. By the next morning, 19 July, the city, what remained of it, was effectively in American hands. And here is where the title promise comes due, because the question that the German captain on Hill 192 had asked himself on the 11th, "How are they doing this without tanks?" finally had a complete answer. The Americans had not abandoned combined arms. They had built a smaller, meaner version of it that worked at the scale of a single field. Suppressive fire from 2 BARs on a far corner, rifle grenades into the brush, a mortar lobbing rounds behind the bank to kill the men hiding from the suppressive fire, engineers blowing a hole in the hedge with a satchel charge, a small team slipping through the breach and immediately working sideways along the inside of the German Hedgerow, grenading the corner positions. Tanks helping when they could reach the field, but the drill working even when they could not. And the part that broke the German army's ability to adapt was not any single element. It was the repetition. The fact that the same drill happened in the next field, and the next, and the next, by units that had never met each other but had read the same mimeograph diagrams in their company command posts. A German operations officer, writing one of the experience reports that would later be captured and translated, summed up the bewilderment in a single line. He described Allied preparations as systematic, almost scientifically conducted. It was a sentence that, in another context, would have been admiration. In Normandy, it was confession. Because what the Germans were admitting in their own internal documents was that they were no longer fighting American mass, they were fighting an American method. And the method was reproducible. The numbers tell the rest. In July 1944 alone, the 227th Field Artillery Battalion fired 10,964 rounds in 525 separate fire missions in support of the St. L drive. That is one artillery battalion, in 1 month, on one part of the front. Multiply it across the army, and the picture that emerges is not of clever infantry tricks alone, but of an infantry method that worked, because every other piece of the American system fed it. Fires, logistics replacements, training memoranda passed from division to division. Lessons learned bulletins like Combat Lessons No. 5, which spread the Bocage drill across the European theatre the same way a textbook spreads a theorem. In the Bocage, on average it took 5 American soldiers to displace 1 German defender. That is the arithmetic Meindl had wanted. He got it. And he still lost. Because the Americans were willing to pay the arithmetic, and because every time they paid it, they got slightly better at it, and the Germans did not. St. L fell on the 19th of July. 6 days later, on the 25th, Bradley unleashed Operation Cobra. The road network that ran through the captured city became the hinge of the entire American breakout. Within weeks, Avranches had been seized, Patton's Third Army was racing east, and the German position in Normandy was unraveling toward the killing ground of the Falaise Pocket. Paris would be liberated on the 25th of August. By autumn, American spearheads were on the German frontier. None of that was possible without the Hedgerow lab around St. L. And yet, in the years that followed, when veterans were asked what had really happened in the Bocage, almost none of them used the language the historians would later use. They did not talk about doctrine. They did not talk about adaptation curves. They talked about a sergeant who had drawn a sketch in the dirt with a stick. They talked about a lieutenant who had said do it again, exactly the same way, until you can do it in your sleep. They talked about an engineer who had taught them how to set a satchel charge against a bank in under 20 seconds. The system was made of those men. The diagrams in the division memoranda were only the shadow that fell across the page when those men acted. The real document was written in muscle memory, in the inside of 1,000 hedgerows, by men who would never write a book about what they had done. The German captain on Hill 192, whoever he was, never wrote a memoir either. He probably did not survive the campaign. If he did, he likely spent the rest of his life trying to explain to people who had not been there why the Americans had won in country that, on paper, should have killed them. If he ever found the words, they might have sounded something like the line a German divisional report grudgingly admitted in late July, in a sentence that historians have been quoting ever since. Americans, the report said, use infantry cautiously. It was meant as a complaint. It was in fact the highest compliment the Wehrmacht ever paid the United States Army in the Bocage, because cautious did not mean slow, it meant methodical. And methodical, in war, is another word for learning. The Germans did not lose Normandy because the Bocage stopped being strong terrain. It never stopped being strong terrain. They lost Normandy because the Americans learned to make the strengths of the Bocage expire faster than the Germans could reuse them. Each field was still a fortress, but each field now took the same recipe to break, and the recipe was being printed faster than the defenders could rewrite their counter. Ernie Pyle, watching it all from a ditch, wrote a line at the end of July that would become, for many of the men who fought there, the truest sentence anyone ever wrote about that summer. This, he said, is the 2 months that broke the German army in the West. He was right. And the place it broke, more than anywhere else, was in a tangle of small green fields south of a ruined cathedral town that almost nobody outside of France had heard of before that summer, and that nobody who fought there ever forgot. The hedgerow stopped being a problem, because the Americans turned every hedgerow into the same problem. The Germans never found a counter, because there was no single thing to counter. The American edge was not one weapon. It was a system that turned every hedgerow into the same solvable problem. That is why the German captain on Hill 192 was puzzled. That is why his commanders by the 17th were no longer asking how to stop the Americans, but only for permission to walk away. And that is why, in the long, quiet records of the St. L battle, you find a number that does not appear on any monument, but that says everything about what happened in those fields between the 7th and the 19th of July. Weeks of fighting, casualties in the tens of thousands, gains measured in single-digit miles, and from those miles, the unlocking of an entire continent. The men who unlocked it did not know they were writing doctrine. They thought they were just trying to get to the next hedge alive. But every time they did, the German army in the west came a little closer to the moment when it would simply stop being able to hold a line. That moment came in a green field nobody had ever heard of, on a quiet morning in July, when a captain who did not understand what was happening to him turned to his runner and asked where the tanks were. And the answer was that there were no tanks. There was only a system. That's another untold chapter of history. If this moved you, hit like, subscribe to WW2 Decoded, and share with a fellow history lover. Comment below. What should we cover next?